So I would like to welcome you to the Atlanta Savannah Passenger Rail Study. And today we're going to talk about the alternatives development. Now, before we get too far, we did just meet Wendy. And if we could maybe, let me go ahead and introduce our project team. We have Joanna Campbell, who's the project manager. She's also the assistant division director for intermodal. You have myself, I'm the assistant project manager. And then we also have Caleb Stubbs, who is our rail and transit planning lead. And then with us today too is our WSP team, who's going to be conducting a few Mentimeters to get some information, but they're also the prime on the contract that is conducting the study itself. So just kind of getting started today, this slide right here just pretty much outlines our objectives for the day. First, we're going to discuss the alternatives development and outline how the study identifies the alternatives. Next, we're going to discuss alternative evaluation and look at how alternatives will be evaluated. And then finally, we're going to discuss passenger rail opportunities and challenges and how other states have implemented passenger rail. So before we get into the objectives, I do want to go over a few of the highlights from the kickoff meeting and share a few of the early results from our online survey. Now, this next slide outlines a few of the highlights from the stakeholder kickoff meeting. Some of the things we went over is that GDOT is leading the study with FRA oversight and stakeholder involvement. The Atlanta Savannah is following the new FRA Corridor ID program. GDOT will coordinate with other Corridor ID projects in the Southeast. And then the final product of the study will be a service development plan. Now, one thing I do want to remind everyone is that after the completion of this study, there is no additional funding allocated for any future steps or phases. So there's basically no money after the study that's allocated. And then GDOT will start with a wide range of options, and that we plan to follow the data. And then, a final note is that freight rail is very important to the state and will be a key consideration throughout the Atlanta Savannah study. One of the things we do want to make sure we do is protect access and capacity for our freight rail partners. Now, if you haven't already, I'd like to invite you to visit the project website. There you'll find information on the project, the first stakeholder meeting video, and then the initial public survey that we're conducting. Now, just a couple of highlights from that initial survey. As of about 20 days ago, under travel trends, we're seeing that 65% of the respondents travel between Atlanta and Savannah at least a few times per year by car, up to once per month. Very few fly because of the expense, and 86% of respondents have traveled by intercity rail, and then 28% use Amtrak, have actually used Amtrak in Georgia. Service preference-wise, responses are pretty much split between faster, more direct service and service with nonstop opportunities. And then most respondents prefer a balance between implementing service sooner and achieving a higher quality of service. So where are these responses coming from? So this is just a quick map just showing you where the responses are coming from throughout Georgia and in other states. We're actually getting responses from Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and as far out as California. So we're getting a lot of interest in this survey so far. I think you may have seen on the other slide at the time that information was pulled, we had over 4,400 responses. So this next slide, this is one you may remember if you did attend the first stakeholder meeting. And here's where we explain the three types of passenger rail service. So we want to make really clear what we're actually doing. So with these three types, first we have rail transit. Now, this is an all-day frequent service. It serves the densest urban population areas. Service is based on headways, basically the time between the trains. It has the most stations, and they're the closest together. And this service is regulated by the Federal Transit Administration. A good example of this service would be MARTA. Next, we have commuter rail. Now, this serves major metro regions, provides daily access for workers between suburbs and city centers during peak commute times. And it does have a lot of stations, but maybe not as many as, say, rail transit. And they are a little closer together, but they do spread them out enough so they can still get certain travel times. This service is also regulated by the Federal Transit Administration. Good example of this would be the Boston T. And then finally, we have, we have our intercity passenger rail study. Now, this is the type of study that we're conducting. Now, this serves long-distance trips and connects multiple major cities. Stations are spaced much further apart, basically to preserve the travel times. And then, unlike the other two, This service is regulated by the Federal Rail Administration. And so there's some pretty big example or pretty big difference there. A couple of examples of this one would include Amtrak or Brightline. Something else to note about intercity passenger rail that would be different from the other two types of service is that intercity passenger rail may not necessarily run during commute times. A lot of times intercity passenger rails may run during the middle of the day, middle of the night, and whatnot. So there's no guarantee that intercity passenger rail could be used for actual commuting. So now let's get into the alternatives development. Now, this is where we identify the range of options to actually be studied. So developing the alternatives included a number of steps. First, we had to determine what is our study area. So we basically take a big picture approach when identifying the study area to the Atlanta-Savannah study. Next, we look at where are the station markets. We identify where these are within the study area and then develop a universe of station markets. And then we look at how do we evaluate the various route options. Now, as part of this, we'll develop considerations for comparing the various route options and station markets. So what is our study area? Basically a third of Georgia. So we have over 15,000 square miles that we're looking at as part of the study. And we're trying to identify specific routes, which we'll kind of go over, at least in a big picture sense, later in the study or later in this presentation. So next we'll look at where. Where would our stations be? So what we want to do is identify and assess a universe of station markets. First, we're going to identify the terminal stations, basically the Atlanta-Savannah. That one's set. And then we're going to look at major stations. Now, these are stations that score the highest in the station markets that serve distinct non-overlapping markets. And then we're going to look at minor stations from there. And these are station markets that don't necessarily rise to the level of major stations, but they still may be within a possible corridor and possibly have a station. Then we'll create and assess a service corridor linking the major stations. After we determine the service corridor, then we'll actually start looking at specific route options. So now a little bit more about the station markets. Now, to identify the station markets, there are a number of factors that were analyzed to determine locations for the stations. Now, this slide outlines the demographic and socioeconomic factors that were looked at to identify the markets. Now, we take this information, throw it into a map, or take all these informations, get the layers, and throw it into a map. And with that, we get station market scoring. Now, this map helps us identify where the major and minor markets are located throughout our study area. So now once we have the terminal and major stations identified, the next step is to create and assess service corridors that are linked by these major stations. Now this is how we evaluate the route options themselves. Now, these service corridors will include unique combinations of major stations between the terminal stations of Atlanta and Savannah. So these next few slides will give you a visual of what corridors we're looking at. And again, we're still looking at the corridors, not necessarily specific routes. We also want to let you know that the stakeholder groups are some of the first ones to actually see these routes that we're reviewing. So first we have Atlanta to Augusta to Savannah. Then we have Atlanta to Athens to Savannah. Atlanta to Macon to Savannah. Atlanta, Athens, Augusta to Savannah. And then we have a straight shot across going from Atlanta to Savannah. Now, these are not in any particular order. These are just how they were arranged in the presentation. But this is but these are the specific corridors we will be looking at throughout this study. All right, so now we'll continue discussing the route option development. Now, for each of the accepted corridors, service corridors, we'll examine multiple route options that serve the exact same major destinations, where they'll have different routings, distances, and potentially different minor stations. Now, as part of the analysis, we will review existing and potential transportation rail networks, the geography, the distances, and possible speeds among other critical criteria factors necessary for decision-making. Now, these types of route infrastructure can be categorized as the following. First, we have our class 1s and our short line railways. Now, these are where we have existing railroad, basically. And so that's a pretty easy one, it seems like on the surface, but when you look at how these lines are already being used, it can get a little bit more complicated. The class 1s generally provide long distance freight service, whereas the short lines provide first mile, last mile connectivity to the rail system, and they connect local industries with lesser service needs to the class 1 network themselves. There are 6 class 1 railroads in North America. 2 of them actually operate in Georgia, CSX and Norfolk Southern. And then we have short lines. We have 25 plus short lines in Georgia. Now, these play a huge role in supporting economic development in the rural Georgia areas. Now, we also have shared use. Now, the shared use, this is the infrastructure that's basically shared by both freight and passenger rail service itself. Now, the shared use can be either a single track service that operates at a different schedule, which does make it a lot more complicated, or it can be a double track, which is within the same right-of-way corridor. Now, again, one of our primary focuses of the study will be avoiding any disruption to freight along the lines we look at. Next, we have the abandoned lines. Now, this is where you have existing infrastructure like track or bridges, but much of the infrastructure is often damaged, outdated, or missing entirely. This will also require infrastructure assessments and upgrades to establish the new service itself. So it's not always as easy as it looks if you think there is a track there. Next, we have our greenfield routes. Now, here's where there's actually no existing corridor or infrastructure. Now, these will require new corridor and all the rail infrastructure if we determine that we need to build on these in these areas. There's also the potential for environmental impacts when we're looking at these areas. We also have the highway routes. Now, this is where there's no existing rail infrastructure along the highway, but right-of-way may be available in some locations. Highway routes also require establishing new infrastructure, and there's the potential modification to the interstate if we do build along there. These can be median running, or it can run down the side of the highway. These routes the route options that we actually end up studying will likely use a combination of these route types I've just mentioned. For example, a greenfield route may use segments of existing rail and or abandoned lines themselves. And here's what I was mentioning a second ago when we were talking about the bike ped piece. We will look at multi-use trail opportunities as part of this project. We're going to be looking for these opportunities to basically use the right-of-way for a multi-use trail where possible, in addition to the rail itself. Now, there may be some potential partnerships in this down the road, whether it's with the bike ped organization and our local government. So now let's discuss the alternatives evaluation itself. So we've reviewed how we're identifying the alternatives to study. So this next slide covers the considerations we'll use to evaluate them. And also, just a little heads up, pay attention to these. We do have a Mentimeter we will be conducting after I go through these. So these considerations will help drive an objective, data-informed evaluation process. This criteria includes ridership markets. This is basically if we're looking for the right combination of users and destinations. Some things we'll look at as job and population centers, special destinations that are in that area. We'll also look at land use. How compatible are these routes with land use and other adopted plans? We'll look at the environmental and try to understand the potential for the environmental impacts as early as possible. We'll also look at travel times. Do these routes offer competitive travel times compared to other modes? We got to make sure that we can at least get you from Atlanta to Savannah in under 3 to 4 hours. And don't quote me on that. That's just that's going to come much later in the study. We'll also look at the destination pairs. We're looking at basically what other markets that can help generate ridership. We'll look at multimodal connections. Do these routes connect with an airport? Do they connect with regional transit? Do they connect with other rail, whether it's existing or potential? We'll look at prior planning and how these routes align with current regional and local planning. And then we'll look at ease of implementation. Here we'll try to identify any known issues early in the process. So these are the range of considerations. So let's now discuss priorities. Should all considerations be weighed equally, or should some carry more weight than others? Now, if they're not all equally, how can we score them? So the weighing criteria can help inform the decision-making and help us align with stakeholder and community priorities. All right, so now we've made it to today's final objective, looking at opportunities and challenges. So I do have a few slides covering passenger rail in other states. Like I just mentioned, we are looking at that. So with this first line, we have North Carolina Piedmont, which is operated by North Carolina DOT and provides daily round trips between Charlotte and Raleigh, overlaying with Amtrak, which also travels longer distances up to New York City. Now, the North Carolina Railroad is a state-owned railroad authorized by the North Carolina legislature, Now, the Piedmont actually started out with one round trip a day, and then they purchased used passenger cars. And then over the past decade, North Carolina DOT, Amtrak, and North Carolina Railroad have secured numerous federal grants to upgrade the infrastructure that supports additional capacity, speed improvements, station upgrades, and ultimately more daily trips and record ridership. Now, this is a great example of starting with a basic service and building a market for intercity passenger rail and leveraging funding to improve service and grow. So next we have Brightline Florida Service, which is also a good example of a privately led owner and operator model. Now, this was initiated by the owner of the freight railroad, Florida East Coast Railway, and it shares right away with it. Now, this service first operated between Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach, and then extended to Miami with additional stations in between. Now, key features of this service include hourly departures, well-designed stations, heavy usage by tourists and airport travelers. And one thing to note is this line does hit 125 miles an hour, but that's only for short sections of the dedicated track. It does not do that throughout the whole service. And then finally, we have Amtrak Virginia. Now, Amtrak Virginia operates the state-supported service in Virginia, meaning the state funding supports additional daily trips between DC and major Virginia cities. Now, travelers can continue north from DC to Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston using Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. Now, the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority was created in 2020 to oversee the Amtrak Virginia service. Now, Virginia Passenger Rail Authority has been successful in leveraging federal grants for improvements, and in recent years, it struck a deal with CSX to acquire the S line for future expansion from Richmond to North Carolina. So we'll go ahead and move toward closing this. Again, we do have a survey up online on our website. That's linked that's listed here. Feel free to share it. It will be open to the end of the month. This will not be our final survey. We will have some other surveys throughout this project. This is over a 5+ year project, so we'll have multiple surveys throughout this project. So this won't be your only opportunity. I know it is a short one, so some of the other ones we will be gathering more information along the way. And with that, I'll go ahead and end. If you do have any other questions or comments, feel free to contact us through our email address. And I'll see a camera turn on. John, did you have another question or comment?
Just wanted to say thanks.
All right, well, great. Well, hey, thank you all so much for your feedback in the Mentimeter polls, for participating in the group breakouts. We got some great information today. I just want to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to talking to you more in the future. Y'all have a good day.